Hello, and welcome to the third and final webinar for the YPL Small Grants Program. My name is Haley Clemson, and I am an Assistant Program Officer at Cultural Vistas and support the YPL Small Grants Program and Initiative. For those of you who have not worked with Cultural Vistas in the past, we are a nonprofit international organization and the implementing partners for the YPL Small Grants Program, a program that is funded by the U.S. Department of State and made possible by the U.S. Department of State U.S. mission to New Zealand. The YPL Small Grants Program is a program under the YPL Initiative, a youth leadership development initiative that is organized by the U.S. Department of State. In 2018, the YPL Small Grants Program was launched and so far has had 5 total iterations, and this will be the 6th. The YPL Small Grants Program is an opportunity for Young Pacific Leaders alumni aged 25 to 40 to apply for small grant funding for up to $10,000 US to implement innovative projects in the Pacific region related to one of the 4 core pillars of the YPL initiative. Those 4 pillars being education, environment and resource management, civic leadership, and economic and social development. To help interested alumni prepare to apply for the YPL Small Grants Program, Cultural Vistas is hosting these preparation webinars to provide additional information about the program as well as to support applicants in the application development process. The first webinar was focused on developing and submitting a grant proposal, and the second webinar was focused on putting together a core project team. This webinar today will be about budget and budget management. Each webinar was recorded and can be found on the Cultural Vistas website, searching for YPL Small Grants Program. You can find them on YouTube as well by searching the playlists on the Cultural Vistas YouTube account. The webinar today is the 3rd and final webinar before the application deadline. This webinar will help teams interested in submitting a proposal to better understand the budgeting process, review the budget template, and help answer any questions about what expenses can and cannot be included in project budgets. For those of you joining us live today, we'll have time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, any questions that you may have. And once we get to that section of the webinar, please raise your hand on Zoom or unmute to ask your question. You're also welcome to submit your questions in the chat as we go along. I'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation. For those watching the recording, please email any questions that you have directly to yplgrants@culturalvistas.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you with those responses before the application deadline. The final recording will be uploaded to the YouTube playlist and YPL website before the end of this week for your reference. And with that, I think we will jump right in. So as a reminder, on screen is the outlined timeline for the YPL Small Grants Program. This is an important timeline for you to note and for your core project team to note and consider as you're preparing your small grants application and proposal. Be aware of the small grants implementation timeline and its importance to your project's development, as your project's timeline should match that of the program. The most important date for the application timeline is the application deadline. The deadline is next week on the 3rd of February by 11:59 p.m. New Zealand local time. As I shared, today's webinar will focus on preparing a small grants budget and how that budget factors into the project management. Creating a budget can be overwhelming, but it is a critical piece of applying for grant funding. The budget you submit in your application further explains the project idea laid out in the narrative by describing the items that you will need to support your project implementation. If your project narrative is the why and the what to what you're proposing, the budget shows the how in many ways. To help, all budget information can be found on the YPL Small Grants website. You can also find the necessary templates and information within the online application. I'll walk you through the process of finding the application and budget template on the website now. This is the YPL Small Grants website where you can find further information on budgeting, FAQs, and any other information on the program. You can find the application link right here, as we saw in the first webinar. And when looking for the budget template, you can scroll most of the way down the application and you'll find the template linked here. An important thing to note is that all applicants must use the provided budget template for your project budget, and you'll need to submit this completed template as part of your proposal. You can also find the budget template on the website as well as the application, and if at any time you have trouble finding it, please let us know. If you're on the application and scroll down to the supporting documents, you can find the template there, and it's linked via Google Drive. If for whatever reason you can't access it there, please reach out to us and we can also provide an Excel document for this template. We've received some questions or requests for editing access to the template, but please note that this document is meant to be a template for anyone interested in applying for the YPL Small Grants program. Because of this, editing access directly in the document link will not be given or available to anyone. To download the document and make edits for your project, you'll need to go to File and Download, and you can download it as a Microsoft Excel document. If you prefer to edit it in Google Drive as well, when accessing it through Google, you can make a copy and save it to your drive for any applicable edits. Now let's look more in depth at the template itself. The budget template spreadsheet is modeled after costs generally associated with grant funding. Since this program is funded by the U.S. Department of State, at Cultural Vistas, we abide by all federal regulations outlined in the U.S. Department of State grant funding opportunities. This includes both the overall YPL small grant programming as well as the individual small grants projects that are funded themselves. The guidelines this program follows are typically guidelines found with other funder requirements for grant opportunities outside of YPL as well, so it's good to pay attention. When applying for grant funding, it's important to always check the budget requirements before applying. This ensures that you provide the correct information and do not request funding for something that cannot be covered. Going back to the items that we discussed in the first webinar, it's very important to make sure that you include all requested and required items listed in the grant application. This applies to any budget instructions or requirements as well. As you can see on the budget template, first, when completing your template, be sure to fill out this top section of the template with your project information. Also, make sure the information that you provide across all of your proposal documents and on your online application is consistent. The project title should match the project title that you include in your application and all of the additional documents that you provide. Same with your budget totals and project currencies. It's important to stay consistent throughout every piece of your proposal. For the project location, you'll need to outline where the project is being implemented. If it's going to take place in multiple countries, please list each country here on the template. The total amount requested and the total cost share are two different things on the budget template. The total amount requested is the amount that you're requesting from the YPL Small Grants program. These funds are the total of what you're outlining in the sections at the bottom of this template, and this is the total amount of money that is being requested from the YPL Small Grants program and has to specifically go to the project that you are outlining as part of your proposal. The total cost share outlines any funds that you may be receiving from other partners or other funders. We've received questions from interested applicants about whether your project can have funding from other sources. The answer is absolutely yes. For any type of grant funding, it's encouraged that you find opportunities to further fund or sustain your project. This shows the sustainability of your project long term. For the YPL Small Grants Program, we do not need to know the specific details of those funds, but do need you to include the total of any other amounts of money that are being cost shared or in-kind donations that you receive for your project from other funders or partners. You'll list the total amount at the top of your budget, but should not outline any specific cost share line items in the remainder of your budget. It's important that each line item only be things that are being funded through the YPL Small Grants Program specifically. Again, demonstrating cost share is not a required piece of the project, but it does highlight sustainability of the project. And if you happen to have a cost share or other funder, we do ask that you list that information. As a reminder, for the 2025 YPL Small Grants Program, you can request up to $10,000 US. Projects may be conducted in local currency of the project team and location. However, you need to be able to show that when the amount is converted, it is equal to no more than that max total of $10,000 US. The total requested amount of funding and the currency being used for the proposed project, again, needs to be consistent across all of your documents, as well as within your budget. This means that the currency shown in line items in your budget should be the same currency as the total amount that is requested. Do not try and request excuse me. Do not try to request $10,000 US in amount with project budget in your local currency. In other words, the total amount requested should not equal 10,000 USD if all of your line items and your budget total is in your local currency. This is important because the budget should reflect how much your project needs and should not default to that total amount of 10,000 US. The currency in which your project would receive the funds, should your project be selected, should match the currency of the total that you are requesting. Again, for the project budget, it's incredibly important that you only request the amount of small grants funds that you need based on the project proposal and budget research that you do. You can request up to $10,000 US, but do not need to request the full amount of money. If you only need $3,000 US to implement your project, only apply for that $3,000 in your proposal and budget requests. You'll need to demonstrate that the money you receive for the project is being fully spent towards the project goals and objectives. If selected, you'll need to remain on target to spend the amount of funds that you requested in full for your project implementation. Therefore, it's important to ask only for the amount of funding that is needed. As your project proposal is reviewed, only feasible projects that outline clearly the connection to the requested funding amount and the project work plan and goals will be selected. One way to ensure that you're not requesting more than needed for the project is to request and search for quoted prices on the budgeted items that you are proposing. For example, if your project is a workshop in which travel to another Pacific location is needed, providing a quote for the flights outlines the amount needed for each participating person to travel. It also ensures that your proposed amount in that line item is in line with the amount that you will need for that expense. Another example may be reaching out to any possible project venues needed for your project so that you can get an estimate on renting that space out. The examples could go on, but the more you can get an accurate estimate for your budget proposal, the better your project will be and having accurate estimations of cost. And that will help your work plan stay on track to complete and use all of those funds. Think of collecting these quotes as a way to most accurately estimate the costs of your budget. Getting one quote will help you understand an accurate estimate and help you budget for the item properly. And then of interest, seeking additional quotes may also support you in getting a better deal that further supports your budget breakdown and how you can have the most cost-effective option for your project plan. These quoted items can be detailed in the budget narrative. If providing information makes your application stronger and helps clearly outline the project goal, we encourage you to include this. This section of the budget is not just there for decoration, and we recommend using the space to help support your proposal and provide further details on the how of your project. It's used to help justify the need for the cost, explain why your budget may need the line item in that category, or offer how costs are estimated and show links to quotes. There's further information on the budget template outlining how best to use this budget narrative. Any additional space needed for budget narrative or uploading any quotes that you feel are important can be added in the supplemental documents upload section of the application. Narrative context can be added for any or each line item within your main budget columns to the left, corresponding with that budgeted line item. You'll see the main parts of the budget to the left are broken up into 4 categories, being supplies, travel, personnel, and other. Each is set to guide you when thinking through your budget breakdown and project costs. As previously mentioned, these 4 sections mirror a similar budget structure to other U.S. Department of State grants. This document helps to provide not only a budget template for this program, but also a learning resource that you can build off of for potential future opportunities for funding that you may apply for. When compiling your budget, remember that budgets are meant to describe or list out what you will be spending money on for your project. In other words, each line needs to demonstrate the cost of what will be purchased to support your project goals and objectives. You do not have to fill out every line in this template, but try to make your budget as detailed as possible. In this top section, you'll find a few instructions to remember as you are drafting your budget. Please be sure to read through the instruction section in full, and you can see the instructions listed on screen as well. We will touch on these instructions in more detail later in the webinar as well. Now to the item description section. As mentioned, and as you can see here, the budget is broken down into those general categories. To discuss the categories and how to put your line items in each category, I'll describe a little bit more about each. Supplies. This is what things do you need to buy to make your project work. For example, if your project needs materials such as paper, pens, posters, anything like that, this is where you would input those costs. This section may be pretty self-explanatory while completing your budget. The next category is travel. This will be any logistical travel costs for your project. Some examples include a workshop where you're bringing people from different Pacific countries to another location within the Pacific, or if your project is in a rural location and you need to bring people from an urban area to the project location. This should include any transportation costs needed in that, such as bus hire or rental, local travel, anything of that sort. Another example, if the project is an exchange, this could be the cost to bring participants for your program from one country to another country. And please note, travel within the Pacific regions is the only travel that's fundable. No travel outside of the eligible YPL countries in the region is allowable in the funding of this program. The third category is personnel. This is a less common expense, generally only included if you have to pay a professional to help implement the project, such as a trainer, facilitator, anything like that for your workshop. This could also be for professional services for items such as multimedia materials, help with website development, anything along those lines. However, it's important to note that this is not intended for salaries or overhead expenses. Salaries and overhead are not allowable with this funding, and we'll go into more detail with that in a moment as well. An important distinction on the difference between this fee-for-service or salary is that a fee-for-service is a one-time payment for a service rendered as part of a contractual agreement with an invoice and memorandum of understanding. Salary, however, is ongoing payments for sustained work. One example of a personnel item that is fundable could be as an honorarium or speaking fee for a professional who assists with your project, and that is not considered salary. However, any honorarium for any YPL Small Grants project should not exceed a total of $250 per speaker, and it's a one-time payment as thank you for their contribution to your project. Finally, the other category will include any costs that don't fall under the first three categories. Some examples may include hotel meeting space rental for a workshop, catering if you're hosting an event during lunch, audio-visual requirements, anything along those lines. If a budget line item doesn't seem to fall in any of the first three categories of the budget, you can input that in the other category. So once you decide which category the expense will go in, you'll need to include the item description of the expense. You then enter the unit cost, which again can either be in US dollars or local currency, but should stay consistent throughout your budget. Again, we do ask that you please be sure to be uniform in this and use the same type of currency consistently for each line item across your project. Otherwise, proposal reviewers may have too many questions and lack clarity on the project plans and budget, which would not help with the project's consideration for funding. Leaving your proposal reviewer with any questions on your project will not support a strong application, and your reviewer will not be able to ask questions to clarify. So it's important that you have details in the budget from the get-go. The entire budget should be in one currency, either all US dollar or all the same local currency. Be sure to include the currency that you are planning to use for your project at the bottom of the spreadsheet. There's a spot for it for you to outline what currency you'll be using. Next, you'll enter the number of units for each item that you're listing. This will be the number of each item that you'll need. For example, if you're budgeting for t-shirts, this could be 27 t-shirts, one for each participant that you may be implementing the program on behalf of. The total line will then be automatically calculated, the line where you see all the zeros now. It will be automatically calculated with the unit cost and the number of units. It's important to remember that all items over $50 must be itemized and described. Do not just include lump sums of the cost without fully describing the anticipated expenses. A lump sum is any line item and description that includes more than one thing. For example, if you're budgeting for promotional materials for your project and want to get t-shirts and tote bags for your participants, t-shirts should have its own line item and tote bags must have their own line item as well. A line item that states promotional materials and has in parentheses t-shirts and tote bags as one line item, for example, is considered a lump sum and should be split up into individual expenses. This is where information from vendor quotes that you may request come in handy, and that helps ensure and outline the accuracy of these estimates for cost per unit. Finally, it's an important reminder that budgets cannot exceed that total of 10,000 US dollars. Successful funding requests will be at competitive rates and prove how cost directly relates to the project. The spreadsheet will automatically tally your project expenses inputted in the categories. And before you upload your final item in the application, be sure to check a few things. First, that each line item in the budget is calculating into the budget total properly. Second, that your final requested amount meets or is below that 10,000 US dollar threshold. And that is including and factoring into any exchange rates that are applicable depending on the currency that you may choose. Third, that your project currency is listed and consistent across the budget. For those planning to use local currency, there's not a set exchange rate that we use. If you decide to use your local currency as the currency for your budget, it's important to factor in the currency conversion rates while developing your budget so that you do not exceed that total allowable amount of 10,000 US dollars. For exchange rates, Cultural Vistas recommends the Awanda currency converter for accurate and up-to-date information on exchange rates. So I will show you that briefly. Here you can see that currency converter that we recommend. This is the site that Cultural Vistas uses regularly when trying to inquire about any exchange rates. And you'll notice that you can adjust both the currency, in which direction the exchange rate goes, and also the date in which you'd like to check the exchange rate for. This is helpful when trying to estimate the currency conversion amount for your budget proposal. If you need any support finding this tool while creating your budget, do not hesitate to email us. And we understand that some currency exchange rates may vary pretty substantially based on the day. If you have any concerns over this affecting your budget and having your budget exceed that 10,000 US dollars or cause any confusion in your proposal, be sure the date is set to the day that you submit your application in calculating the exchange rate, and include a note on this in the budget narrative or as any optional supplemental supporting documentation. Back to the template. As general practice, it's important to remember that for grant budgets, you should try not to move money between these budget categories when you're implementing your project. This further outlines why it's important to estimate the expenses that you foresee in your proposed budget and make them as accurate as possible. You can reallocate money throughout implementation, but never more than 20% of the category total. This is not encouraged, but if necessary, any changes or reallocation should be done with approval from the grant administrator, in this case being Cultural Vistas for the YPL Small Grants Program. For those of you who may be new to budget management, it's easiest to try and avoid reallocating funds. Again, why it's so important to have a strong budget during this template and proposal development. However, it can be allowable in minimal amounts as a contingency or when extenuating circumstances may arise. But again, any changes after your project may be selected need to be done in communication with Cultural Vistas. Also, as noted on the template, there are certain items that the YPL Small Grants funds cannot be used to cover. You can find this in this Remember section of the template, and we'll go over what cannot be covered now. So the YPL Small Grants funds cannot be used to cover international airfare to or from the United States. This is unless you have a team member from Hawaii or an American affiliated Pacific territory, for example, and are conducting an exchange program, or that core team member needs to travel for the program to the project location. This would be considered allowable on a case-by-case basis and is a good example of why the budget narrative is so important. If you need something like this funded, providing the justification for why it contributes to the project goals will offer the context for why the expense should be allowable. Also not allowed is staff salaries, overhead expenses, or office rent. If you need a meeting space, funds can go towards a shared workspace on a specific date and time for a venue for your project. However, it cannot be used to justify any kind of long-term lease. Unconnected, but on a similar note, if your project needs a subscription service for your project work plan, such as Zoom, such a subscription may be allowable, but you can only budget for that subscription within the time period of implementation. So you'd only be able to budget for 6 months in which your YPL Small Grants project is being implemented. Also, large items of durable equipment are not allowable under YPL Small Grants funding. This is an area where we've received a lot of questions on. Large items of durable equipment are not usually funded, but a reasonable request for equipment may be made on a case-by-case basis. These items cannot be for personal profit, however. An example may be a printer. If you can explain why it's needed and imperative for your project, as well as why renting it would not be a feasible option, why it pertains to the work that you're doing and what you're printing, why what you're printing is necessary, then it could be considered as fundable. We would additionally ask that you consider the sustainability of any large item of durable equipment when making your proposal. What would happen to that item, and what would it be used for after the 6 months of implementation time? These justification points can be supported again in that budget narrative section of the template. YPL Small Grants funds can also not be used to cover excessive representational meals or entertainment. For example, something that would not be fundable is if you requested funds to host a gala dinner. Also, on this note, you may have noted from past YPL events that all U.S. government funds cannot be used for alcohol. So this may not be budgeted for at all in your proposal. Academic research is something else that is not fundable. This is not an academic grant. This is a project-focused grant looking for specific deliverables and outcomes, and therefore needs to show specific deliverables and outcomes in your project proposal. Also not fundable is partisan political activity. Funding cannot be used or applied to any government agencies or political activities. Again, if you're unsure about whether anything specific to your budget is an allowable expense for the grant, given that these items cannot be funded, please email us at yplgrants@culturalvistas.org, and we can help clarify with you directly. That brings us to the end of the budget template review, and now to managing the project and reporting on the money spent by your project team if selected. As noted in the second webinar, the funding for the YPL Small Grants Program will be dispersed in 3 separate allotments, and project teams will be required to provide a report every month for project implementation that details their expenses along with an update of how the project implementation is running. To remind you, if selected to participate in the YPL Small Grants Program, the project treasurer will receive 60% of the funds for the project after the kickoff workshop in April. So this means that if you request the full 10,000 US dollars following the kickoff workshop and before your project begins, you would only receive 6,000 US dollars. The project treasurer will then receive 35% of the funds after submitting the monthly reports for the first 2 months of implementation and the midterm report. At this midterm point in your project, you would receive, following that first example, you would receive 3,500 US dollars. And finally, the project treasurer would then receive the last 5% of the project funds after submitting the final report and all project results. It's important to think about project management as you're developing your project work plan and application submission, especially thinking through matching the expense timeline to the funding disbursement timeline of the program. For example, if you know that the majority of your project spending will occur upfront at the beginning of your project, you'll need to think about how you will offset all of these costs of those upfront items that you cannot cover with that initially received 60% of the small grant funding. At the kickoff workshop, we'll work with all selected project teams closely to make sure that everyone understands the reporting requirements and how to track expenses, as well as what is possible during the budget management period. Following the kickoff workshop, each team will receive 60% of funding that they've requested. Selected teams will only be eligible to receive the funding that was approved in the initial proposal. So once you submit the budget for your project in the proposal application, that will be the total budget for your project through implementation to the end of the program. The transfers of project funds will be sent as a bank transfer to the project treasurer. Cultural Vistas will be covering the cost of any bank transfer fees, so you don't need to budget for this in your project budget. However, if you have a project that may require you to move money between accounts after receiving the funds from Cultural Vistas, then you may want to consider adding a line item in the other category of your budget for any additional bank fees that you might anticipate. Each month, project teams will submit a project report and will need to include a budget report along with a narrative on project updates. The budget report will demonstrate expenses for the month, maybe overall if it's a midterm or final report. And the budget report will also outline the remaining balance for each line item that is yet to be spent for the project. This report will also need to include copies of all receipts and expenses. These reports will be due on the last day of the month, New Zealand time, each month. More information will be provided about reporting to any selected teams during the kickoff workshop. However, it's important to note now, just so you have an understanding of what project implementation will look like, especially for budget management as you form your proposal. At the midpoint of implementation period, there will be a midterm report, and that will ask for additional information and an analysis of how project implementation is going. After the midterm report is received, the project team will receive that next 35% of their funding. And in the final month of the implementation period, teams will submit a final project report and then receive the final 5% of that allocated funding. Please note, however, that the final 5% of funds will not arrive to your team's treasurer account until after the end of the implementation period. As mentioned, teams will be required to provide receipts as part of budget management and reporting on expenses at each report. This tiered disbursement and allotment assure that each project is meeting the work plan that is outlined and agreed upon. It's important to note each of these items as you're developing your proposal, because you need to think through how each will be factored into the project management timeline and the team responsibilities. Following the final report, the debriefing seminar will also take place in early December 2025. At this seminar, a project representative will discuss their successes, challenges, learnings, and full project outcomes. As mentioned in previous webinars, programming and expenses, including visa fees and travel to New Zealand, will be covered by Cultural Vistas and do not need to be included in your project budgets. As we conclude this webinar, I want to reiterate what I mentioned earlier. We will be working closely with all selected participants during the kickoff workshop and during project implementation period to ensure that your budget meets and addresses project needs. The proposal budget should be focused on telling your project story through the items that you need in order to make your project happen. You need to demonstrate how you plan to achieve the project that you describe in your narrative description and your abstract through what you add in your budget as well. The budget is a part of the project story that you're writing in your proposal. It's part of that story that you're trying to tell to represent what you're proposing to do with the funding. So don't forget the importance of the budget in explaining the work that you hope to do. Again, this is much of the how of your project, if the project narrative is more the why and the what. Overall, during the review of applications, the review panel will be looking at whether project budgets align with the proposed project goals and objectives, as well as the project's overall impact. It's important to keep in mind while constructing your budget that the three things that we look for in project application are feasibility, sustainability, and scalability. Feasibility being, can you complete the project in the given time period? Is the budget accurate and will it be achievable? Sustainability being, how can the project continue to implement the targeted community past the 6 months of the funding timeframe? And scalability being, how can the project continue to grow in size or impact after the YPL Small Grants program? So now to the questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions on budgeting, but first I'd like to start with some common funding questions that we've received from other YPL Small Grants programs, potential applicants in the past. And we share the answers to these frequently asked questions because they may answer questions that you don't even know that you have until they're asked. So while I go over these frequently asked questions and their answers, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask once they're completed, please prepare to type them in the chat or send away. And we'll have time to unmute and ask any questions after I go through these. So here are some common budget related questions that we've received from past iterations of the program. What do I need to consider when making purchases for the grant? So project teams need to have due diligence when estimating their costs, meaning that they can demonstrate the expenses are cost effective. This is where those quotes that we discussed come into play. So not just picking your favorite airline, but showing that you're comparing costs to go with a reasonable and average priced expense to support your budgeting. Again, one way to do this is to search multiple possibilities for quotes and give you an idea of what is the most cost-effective option. Another question we often receive is, can I request funding for an already established project? Or would it be allowable for our proposed project to use YPL funds to supplement an upcoming project that we are planning to implement during the YPL grant period? So in this context, cost sharing is allowable and highlights the sustainability of your project. So if you have an existing project or work that you're doing that can help cost share, that's great as well. If you're proposing a collaboration with an existing project, this project would need to still fulfill the requirements listed under the YPL Small Grants program guidelines, and would need to be within one of the 4 YPL pillars still. In your project application and proposal, you'll need to outline the work already completed in this project and emphasize how the YPL Small Grants 6 months of funding will further the work that you're doing with the project already. Your application and budget must demonstrate and showcase the specific ways that the YPL Small Grants funds will be applied over the 6 months of the program implementation period. Some examples of this in context are a previous grant recipient applying for a grant in relation to their current work with an e-commerce platform, where they applied for grant funding specifically to build their mobile app and online presence for the existing organization to enhance their presence on social media. Another example of a project from a few years back is expanding on an established reading program where they used funding to bring their program online to make sure it was more widely accessible during the COVID-19 pandemic, and was able to reach more students. Another common question is, do we need to include other sources of funding if we get outside project sponsors? So we did address this a little bit in the beginning of the webinar, but yes, please include that amount in the sum of funds outlined in the total cost share line of the budget template. Again, we just want to see that overall amount that's cost shared just to show additional support or funding for your project, but it's not a requirement. Another question is, can the funds for the program be used to implement stages of the plan after the 6 months? So for this, the funds that you request should be set out to be fully used for the implementation of the project within that 6-month implementation period outlined in the program. As the implementation occurs, selected teams need to ensure that these funds are used within the funding period for the YPL Small Grants program. So make sure when you're writing your proposal that you're aware that all of your funds that you're budgeting for and have requested as your total amount are set to be used in full by that time of the final report at the end of November 2025. Another question is, do I need to provide documents or price quotations with my budget proposal? So I did mention that quotes are very helpful in structuring the formation of your budget, but no, they are not required. If you're trying to demonstrate the need for large equipment, we do ask that you provide a quote. And again, we recommend that if you're planning to include any large equipment or budgeted items that are larger purchases in your budget, to also please reach out to Cultural Vistas for confirmation that those items can be funded if they're in that section on the budget that says they may not be allowable. Another question is, can I include subscriptions such as a website host domain or Zoom subscription? Again, this may be a direct cost associated with your project and is allowable, but can only be charged for the length of the grant, so 6 months. You cannot budget for more than 6 months of any subscription for your project. Can administrative fees be covered? So administrative fees can be considered under salary, office space, and overhead expense category of the budget, which is not fundable. In terms of personnel, an honorarium or speaking fee for a professional assisting with your project is fundable and is not considered a salary. However, again, honorariums should be limited to $250 per speaker. So going off of that and honorariums, another question we often receive is, can an honorarium be provided to core team members of the project? The answer to that is no. That would be considered a salary or compensation for the project work and is not allowable. But you can provide an honorarium to outside speakers or professionals. But work for the project by core team members must be done in-kind donations. A budget item that you could consider to help team members and cover any costs that they might see during project implementation is that you can budget for core team member travel, hotel lodging, and per diem costs for meals. Anything like that that's needed to implement your program. All right, another question is, rather than using the project treasurer's bank account, would it be okay for us to open a bank account specifically for the project? The answer to this is yes, it's acceptable. You're welcome to create a bank account specifically for the project. And if selected to participate in the YPL Small Grants Program, you'll just need to provide the information for that bank account when prompted by Cultural Vistas. Should we include in-kind donations? In-kind meaning in terms of utilizing resources like supplies, paper, anything like that may be offered by partners or community. And you do not need to list this in your budget at all. If you do happen to know about any of these items from the proposal time of your project, you're welcome to include estimated costs for those in-kind donations in that total cost share spot at the top of the template. Let's see. Another common question that's important to mention is, may we have a contingency budget included? So a general lump sum contingency budget line item is not recommended in your grant proposal budget. This is why Cultural Vistas stays in contact with selected teams throughout the implementation period to help course correct if teams find themselves concerned or in need of some assistance with budget management during the implementation period. Throughout the project, it's important to remember that you need to be able to demonstrate that you're spending the money on the requested items through this program. So because of that, a general contingency lump sum is not allowed, and all budgeted items need to go directly towards expenses that work to achieve the project goals. Should any extenuating circumstances arise that you would theoretically use a contingency lump sum for, Cultural Vistas will be available to help throughout project implementation to help you reallocate your budget in the case that something like that happened. So we don't recommend that you budget for any extenuating circumstances from the point of your proposed budget. So that is it for past frequently asked questions. I hope that mentioning and answering these FAQs may support you in further understanding budget creation and management. But now we'll move on to any questions that those in attendance may have. And for those who have questions that may not come up until after the conclusion of the webinar today, or when you're reviewing the recording, please feel free to send those questions to YPLgrants@culturalvistas.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you with an answer prior to application close. All right, let's see the chat. One question we have is, can the proposed budget include equipment, for example, a video camera? So the example of a video camera is very helpful to actually discuss now. A video camera would be considered a large item of durable equipment, which is not typically fundable. In this scenario, we'd recommend, if you can, looking into quotes for renting that equipment during the length of project implementation to fulfill whatever needs you may need it for during this time just under a rental. If that's really not feasible, reach out to us. There's other options, but generally, as you're thinking of large items of durable equipment, the first thing that you should think through to get around that and make that item allowable is to consider renting it and not purchasing it. Another question we have is, can the budget include desktop and monitor? This is a very similar answer to that of the video equipment. It is case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, you should think about these large items of durable equipment for how they could be accessed just for the length of program implementation, or how can they contribute to the sustainability of your program. And any of this information can be included in that budget narrative of the template, which will help kind of explain the context of why you need it for your project, and help your proposal reviewer understand why it might be something that you're requesting on that case-by-case basis. Let's see. Another question we have is, if the application is multi-country and those countries that the project is being implemented in use a certain currency, but the treasurer is based in a country that uses another currency, is it okay to use the treasurer's local currency in the application? The answer to this is yes. The big thing that we ask for at the time of proposal is that your budget needs to be consistent across the entire budget. So you can pick whatever currency works best for you and your core project team. If that means using the currency that the project is taking place in, this might be easier to get quotes, anything like that. But if you choose to have it in the currency of the treasurer, that is okay as well. You just need to consider exchange rates as you're estimating those costs and getting quotes and building out the budget. So again, I recommend discussing that with the core project team and finding the system that will work best for tracking currencies in the most accurate way for your budget proposal, and then staying consistent throughout the budget. Another question that we have is, do we expect this program to be impacted by any presidential executive orders? At this time, everything is operating and continuing, so we do not believe so. However, any updates to the program will be shared with those selected for the program. I believe that's all the questions in the chat. Does anybody have any other questions that they want to unmute for, or any last chance to submit extra questions to the chat?
I had a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just Dominic here, just on the budget narrative in the Excel spreadsheet, like how much justification can we do? Like a paragraph per line or just a sentence? Because obviously I want to try and provide as much detail as possible, but not like overdo it. Or should we try and include extra supporting documentation for the quotes? I'm just thinking of like trying to explain it create that narrative? You know, is there like
Yeah,
a word limit or anything?
absolutely. That's a great question. There's not a word limit. Um, Unfortunately, I don't want to give a hard answer on this because I think that the way that you utilize your budget narrative depends quite a lot on what items you're budgeting for and what kind of justification needs to be provided. For example, we would ask for, more information on any items that you're budgeting for that maybe those more case by case basis, or like if you're proposing a budget that's very heavy in travel, offering the justification for why that's necessary to achieve your project goals and outcomes. So how much you use that budget narrative to justify your line items really depends on what those line items are and how much justification is needed. Um, I would say submitting that template um, with an extensive amount of writing in that column might get slightly difficult to read. So if you find that you're reaching a point where your budget narrative is messing with how the template reads, you may want to consider adding a Word document where you just mention certain expenses in your budget and provide that narrative as one of your supporting documents. So just keep in mind that as your proposal is being reviewed, everything should be, um, clear and concise, readable, so that whoever's reviewing the proposal can understand what you're proposing. In which case, it might be helpful to have that additional supporting document and make everything a bit more readable. Does that answer your question, Dominic?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay. We also have a question, is the FAQ online for review? We do have some frequently asked questions listed on the YPL Small Grants website. There are not many of them listed there at this time, and they're not all the ones discussed in this webinar. However, if you'd like to revisit the FAQs and any of the answers that I provided within this webinar, you can access the recording of this. It will be posted most likely by tomorrow morning, New Zealand time. Maybe the next day, we'll see. But you can access the webinar recordings on that YPL Small Grants website. There's a link that says webinars right to the right of the embedded video that you'll see on the website. You can also find the recordings and revisit any of the FAQs by searching Cultural Vistas on YouTube, and you'll be able to find in the Cultural Vistas YouTube playlists, you'll find a playlist that includes all past webinar recordings, and will include the recording from today as well. Okay, if no more questions, I'd just like to say, please don't forget that the application closes next Monday, the 3rd of February at 11:59 p.m. New Zealand time. So please be sure to submit your applications following that deadline. And we very much so look forward to reviewing your proposals. Many thanks to everyone who was able to attend. And again, if you need to revisit anything from the webinars, the recordings will be added to that YouTube playlist soon.